Hi, I'm Christy. Welcome to Weird and Witchy Shit, a place for, well, weird and witchy shit. Here we talk about everything from the magic of yoga, rituals, tarot, crystals, astrology, self-love, mental health, spiritual stuff, spooky things, and anything of the mystical variety. So if that sounds like the kind of shit you're into, then you're in the right place, my friend. Welcome to the coven. Today we will be talking about the exorcism of Rowland Doe, possibly the most well-known demonic possession and exorcism story in the entire world. And in fact, this exorcism story is so famous and so well-known that the iconic horror movie and novel The Exorcist was actually based on the events that we are going to be discussing in today's video. Let me take you back to the late 1940s to a small town called Cottage City in Maryland, USA. Here is where 13-year-old boy, who we'll be referring to as Rowland Doe. Rowland Doe is actually a pseudonym and not his real name. A fake name was used to protect his identity because he was a minor. His name was eventually released to the public after he had died, but I'm just going to go with Rowland Doe because I believe that his wishes were that nobody knew his name, otherwise he would have already went out there and told the story himself. And Rowland Doe is also interchangeable with Robbie Mannheim, which is also a pseudonym that was used for him, but to us he'll just be Rowland. And Rowland was pretty much your average teenage boy. He was described as being very normal, if not just maybe a little bit highly strung. He was a little bit hyperactive, a little bit cheeky, a little bit of a prankster, but all in all, just very normal behaviour for a 13-year-old boy. Rowland lived with his mum and his dad and his grandmother. The family were very religious and they followed the teachings of the Lutheran Church, which is a branch of Christianity. Rowland was an only child, so he developed very close bonds with the adults in his life, and one adult in particular was his Aunt Harriet, who they normally just called Tilly. Tilly didn't stay with the family, she actually stayed out in St. Louis, but still her and Rowland were incredibly close to one another. And their particular bond was over what some may describe as strange interests. Me, and possibly you, if you're here on this channel, wouldn't necessarily see these things as strange interests, but it's the late 1940s, baby. They're weirdos. You see, Tilly was incredibly into the spiritualist movement, which was a social religious movement that held the belief that in death there was an afterlife. And not only did spirits continue to live on in death, but we humans could communicate with spirits. Originally, talking to the dead, known as necromancy, was mainly left to professional spiritualists, mediums and psychics, but during this spiritualism movement in the 1940s, more and more people were practicing talking to the dead from their own home when the popularity of a tool called the Ouija board was on the rise. I actually have a whole weird and witchy shit episode that is entirely dedicated to the Ouija board. That is the last episode that I would have posted, and in that I deep dive into the history of the Ouija board, how it came about, some true life spooky stories, and if the Ouija board actually works, if it's this spiritual phenomenon or if it is just subconscious movement by the person moving the planchette. And although the Ouija board can be used to contact dead relatives and loved ones that have passed on, it has long been feared that the Ouija board might invite in some dark entities, evil spirits, and maybe even Satan himself. So that leads us to January 15th, 1949 at the Doe household, when Rowland's mum starts to hear a lot of scratching in the house that sounds like it's coming from inside the walls. She thinks that this is more than likely rats in the walls, so they call out an exterminator, and when the exterminator comes out, he's a little bit confused because he's like, I don't know what you're hearing in the walls, but I don't think it's rats because there's absolutely no sign that you have any rodents in the house. However, night after night, the scratching persists, and the family start to think that maybe it's Rowland playing some kind of prank on them or something. You know, he's a little bit of a jokester. But it quickly became apparent that it wasn't Rowland playing this prank, because it started to happen when Rowland was literally sitting right there in front of them. So they were like, okay, obviously that's not what this was. 11 days after the first suspicious scratchings, the family received some devastating news that Aunt Tilly had sadly passed away. And obviously this was incredibly hard on all of the family, but incredibly hard on Rowland. And it's not actually documented anywhere that this is absolute fact, but I don't think it's a huge leap to believe that Rowland would lean a little bit heavier on esoteric methods, such as using the Ouija board and trying to lean more into this spiritualism, especially if it was something that he was already pretty interested in and something that he really shared with his aunt. It makes a lot of sense that if he believed that he could contact the spirit world, he would try and do that a little bit more now that his favourite aunt had passed on. Like any grieving, mourning child or even person who believed that they could contact the spirit realm would probably do. From this point onward, after Aunt Tilly's death, the scratching in the walls only gets worse and worse. It gets louder and louder, and the noise seems to be surrounding Rowland's room in particular. These soft scratches turn to louder scratches and more frantic scratches, and eventually, well, quite quickly actually, this transformed into knocking, banging, and at one point it even sounded as if troops were marching towards Rowland's bedroom. So this wasn't just your average like knock 3 times if you're there, like this was like hardcore, noticeable fucking bang bang bangs. But at one point Rowland's mum does ask Tilly if that's you, knock 3 times, and they hear 3 very loud, very clear knocks right after this. But the family soon came to realise that they didn't really think that this was Tilly, because they know that if she was going to communicate with them in any way, she wouldn't want to frighten them. She definitely wouldn't want to frighten Rowland in this way that she was choosing to communicate, or whoever or whatever this was choosing to communicate was very threatening, very frightening, not very, hey, I'm your sweet Aunt Tilly, nurturing, loving person, just here to say hi, I'm okay, I hope you're safe and well. This was very different to that, so they started to believe that they didn't think this was Tilly at all. Oftentimes it's said that evil spirits will try and masquerade as somebody that you loved, because you're more likely to invite your sweet Aunt Tilly into your home rather than you're like, hey Tilly, is that you? And they're like, no bitch, I'm Satan. You're not going to be like, oh, come on in sweetheart, have a cup of tea. Obviously not. So it is said that it is very common for spirits to pretend to be someone else so that you'll open yourself up to them more, and then they can enter your space, maybe even your body, and begin to possess or take over. From this point on, the weird shit in the house honestly just continued, and it started to escalate rather quickly. Whereas before it was only noises that the family could hear, and quite scary, quite intrusive noises at that. But now there was actual physical, tangible, visible evidence of things moving that they could see right in front of their face. So things like furniture would move, and it would start by just a stool randomly tipping over on its own, and when someone would go and sit it the right way, a couple of minutes later it would fall over onto its side right away again. And then this continued to grow, and to the point where chairs were spinning round completely on their own. Dishes started flying across the room and smashing against the wall when no one was even near them. And all these weird phenomenons were definitely intensified when Rowland was about. It definitely seemed connected to him more, or to affect him a lot more. And this became clearer when during the night Rowland would wake up having these night terrors. He would wake up screaming and sweating from terrible, horrible nightmares. Not only was he waking up from nightmares, again this continued to escalate when he would wake up during the night. His mum and dad would go in to check on him, and his bed would be violently shaken, as if somebody was vibrating or shaking the bed, when obviously he wasn't doing it. He was sitting in the middle of his bed shaking and crying and absolutely terrified at what was happening. Things got so bad that even the neighbours could hear shit going on in the house. They says that there was screams, there was bangs, there was smashing, and there was just complete chaos every single night, whereas beforehand there had been no issues like that from the family. Rowland's parents said that during these episodes, Rowland would even start to talk in a voice that wasn't his own voice. It was as if some sort of demon was taking over him. It was described as a deep, guttural, demonic voice, and the things that he was saying was things that was entirely out of character for Rowland. Not only was it sounding not like him, the actual things that he was saying was things that Rowland would never ever say. And it wasn't even just at home that things would happen, because his classmates would start to notice weird things happening around Rowland as well. For instance, they witnessed his school desk vibrating and shaking in the same way that his bed was when he wasn't even touching the desk. His books would randomly fly across the classroom without anyone having touching them. And eventually Rowland's mental and physical health started to decline, because obviously all this shit was happening, but on a physical level he physically could not sleep at night because of all the shit that was going on. And he became so unwell, and so much weird stuff was happening, that he actually had to be pulled out of school because he could no longer continue going. The family didn't really know what to do about Rowland, so they took him to a doctor, hoping that maybe a doctor could help him. They thought that he was experiencing at night could potentially be some sort of seizure related to epilepsy or something like that. I don't know what kind of fucking epilepsy makes a whole ass fucking demon take over your body, but okay, I guess, what else would you do? Anyway, the doctor found nothing at all physically wrong with Rowland. So the family then thought maybe this was a mental illness that he had going on. So they took him to see both a psychiatrist and a psychologist, who both said that there was absolutely nothing wrong with him. He was described as normal but highly strung, and let me tell you, in his situation I'd be pretty fucking highly strung as well. So then, as a last resort, they decided to go to their church for guidance on what to do next, because they were kind of just at a loss, and they consulted with the pastor of their Lutheran church, Luther Miles Schultz, who was at first very sceptical of what was going on, but agreed to try and help the family anyway. So once consulting with the family, he thought that maybe they were dealing with a poltergeist. So a poltergeist is a kind of spirit or energetic being that causes disturbances, much like what the family were experiencing. And the thing with poltergeists is normally they are more connected to an area, such as a home. and they don't normally attach themselves onto a person. So if this was a poltergeist issue, it would be an issue with the home that the Does were living at. So they thought it would be a good idea to remove Doland. So they thought that it would be a good idea to remove Rowland from the home and have him go and stay with the pastor overnight, and his mum went with him. So that night, Rowland and his mum go and stay with the pastor, and sure enough, as soon as the lights go out, Rowland's bed starts vibrating and shaking about. So he then goes off the bed and goes to sleep on an armchair instead. But shortly after he fell asleep, he was woke up with, once again, the chair vibrating and shaking. And the chair was actually moving around so violently that it actually tipped Rowland out of it and onto the floor. So this wasn't just like your little jiggle. This was a full scale like rattling about. So hopefully to try and avoid any kind of injury, the pastor suggested that Rowland sleep on a mattress on the floor. But even this didn't work because the mattress started sliding back and forward in the room and even banging itself up and down. So really there was no escape from this shit. Rowland stayed with the pastor for a few nights so that he could get a good idea of what was going on. And during this couple of nights, the pastor claims to have seen red scratches appear on Rowland's body as if from nowhere. But it was as if some sort of invisible entity was clawing him right in front of him because the scratches would just appear. Pastor Schultz quickly realised that this was well out of his scope of expertise and he didn't really know what to do. So he suggested contacting a Catholic priest because Catholic priests are all about that exorcism and getting rid of dark entities and all that, aren't they? So the family contacted Edward Albert Hughes, who was an assistant pastor of St James's Church, who agreed to meet with the family. Hughes says that as soon as Rowland entered the room, there was a very sudden drop in temperature right away, as if the place suddenly went freezing cold. Everyone in the room got chills all over their body, and the telephone that was sitting on his desk went randomly sliding across the room of its own accord. And Rowland, at one point, in a voice that hadn't been his usual voice that he had come in and started speaking with, it was again this kind of guttural demonic voice, asked, "Why bother me, priest of hell?" And this was enough to convince the priest that he might be dealing with Satan and that the boy maybe needed an exorcism. I don't know why that made me giggle there. It's just like, why bother me, priest of hell? And he's like, yeah, this boy is possessed by Satan. And I'm just kind of comparing it to like today's times. Like, can you imagine like a teenager saying that to a priest nowadays? The priest would be like, yeah, you're just a dickhead, but I don't think that you've been invaded by Satan. Hughes believed that this possession could have been caused by Rowland's occult interests and that he accidentally invited evil into him while trying to communicate with the dead. Hughes then contacted his senior, who was Archbishop Patrick O'Boyle, because, like I said, he believed that the boy needed an exorcism, but you can't just willy-nilly go and give somebody an exorcism. You have to get permission from your higher up and also provide some sort of evidence that that is actually what is going on. So Rowland is admitted to Georgetown Hospital for the exorcism to be performed, and here he's strapped down to a bed because exorcisms can get pretty violent at times, so they thought it was best to strap him down in case he tried to hurt anybody or he was having such strong convulsions that he hurt himself. While Father Hughes is performing the exorcism and chanting biblical verses, Rowland manages to actually slip free of one of his wrist restraints and somehow manages to pull a string from inside the mattress of the bed. So he takes this spring and he slashes Father Hughes from shoulder to wrist, and this injury on his forearm was so bad that it actually required 100 stitches. Reportedly, Hughes was never actually the same again, and his arm never entirely healed back to what it was before, and emotionally this whole incident was so draining and so horrifying that he never he was never quite the same again emotionally either. This exorcism, as you can imagine, was unsuccessful, and Rowland was sent back home where things got even worse. One night during the screaming, crying, shouting, demonic voices, violent bed shaking chaos, Rowland's family came into the room to check on him, and they says that they witnessed again these scratches appearing all over his body in front of their very eyes, and they said there was absolutely no way that anyone could have done it to Rowland, and he couldn't have done it to himself because they were literally seeing with their eyes the scratches appear. These deep cuts actually spelled out a word on Rowland's body, and the word that it spelled out was Lewis. And because the family were losing hope and they felt like they had really exhausted all, they had tried everything basically. They've been to a doctor, they've been to a mental health professional, they've been to the church, he's had a fucking exorcism, nothing has helped. They don't really know what to do. So they took this Lewis as maybe a sign that they should go to St. Louis. And if you remember, St. Louis is where Aunt Tilly lived. They did also have other relatives living in St. Louis. So Rowland's paternal uncle, his wife and their children lived there. And this family were all devout Catholics. So on March 8th, 1949, the family packs up and moves to St. Louis. Things actually seem to get worse for the family because every night the same experiences kept happening. But not only that, Rowland was deteriorating quite a bit. Sources say that he just seemed tormented and he had lost all zest for life, and he was almost like a shell of the boy that he used to be. He didn't laugh much, he didn't smile much, he was pretty much like a walking zombie and running on zero fumes. Rowland's older cousin, who he was living with in St. Louis, after witnessing everything that had been happening to her little cousin, she decided to ask her college professor, Father Raymond Bishop, for advice. So on March 11th, Raymond Bishop and his associate Jesuit priest, Father William Bowdern, came to the family home. So at first they're reading scripture to Rowland and everything seems fine and calm and normal until a bottle of holy water flies across the room and smashes against the wall, and then a bookshelf that was in the room started moving and shaking and actually moved its way over to the door and locked Rowland inside of the bedroom. So obviously this was nothing like what Father Bowdern had ever seen before in his life. So he turned to a manual called the Roman Ritual, which is basically a 17th century guide to exorcism, and this mainly involves prayer. And listen, I am a firm believer that there is nothing that you can achieve with the right tutorial, and this is pretty much what William Bowdern was doing. He was like, I don't fucking know what to do, let me see if there's a tutorial on YouTube, and that was kind of like the equivalent of that back in those days. Somebody's wrote a manual, fuck it, I'll try it. Almost like when I first taught myself a smoky eye. If you're younger than me, then you might not remember, but I first taught myself to do a smoky eye, or I was taught to do a smoky eye by following step-by-step instructions on a makeup magazine. Have I just aged myself? And to be honest, exorcisms weren't actually very common at the time, so it wasn't really known what to do. So really his only option was to study texts that people had written who had already been successful or unsuccessful in exorcisms, so that he would know what to do or what not to do. And there was one exorcism in particular that he studied that had been deemed a successful exorcism, and it was that of Emma Smits, also known under the pseudonym of Anna Eklund, who underwent an exorcism in 1912, but that's a story for another day. If you enjoy this episode, give it a thumbs up and let me know, and I will maybe do an episode on that exorcism as well. Again, Father Bowdern would need permission from his higher up to actually perform an exorcism, and for this, again, he had to prove that Rowland was under risk of demonic possession. So let's talk a little bit about the 4 stages of demonic possession. I was going to say depression. Been there. The first stage is demonic infestation, which is evil in a location or object, such as a home or like Annabelle or some shit. The second is demonic vexation, is when someone experiences physical demonic attacks, I guess like the scratches appearing on Rowland's body. The third would be demonic obsession, when someone experiences mental demonic attacks. I guess this could be classed as the nightmares he was having and the rapid decline in his mental health. And finally, full possession is where a demon or evil entity fully takes over a person's entire being. And it was apparent that Rowland had definitely experienced the first 3, and the fear was that it would then get to stage 4, which would be full-blown demonic possession. Bowdern managed to convince Archbishop Joseph Ritter that Rowland did indeed need an exorcism, and he also asked him to appoint somebody to do this exorcism. He didn't want to do the exorcism himself because he felt like, 1, he wasn't knowledgeable or powerful enough to perform this exorcism, and 2, he also didn't feel like he himself was far enough along on his spiritual journey to be able to actually undertake such a huge thing. But the Archbishop pretty much said, tough shit, Bowdern, you want the boy to have an exorcism? He can, but you're doing it. So March 16th, 1949 marked the start of a series of exorcisms on Rowland Doe, performed by William Bowdern and assisted by Raymond Bishop and Walter Halloran, who was another priest. I can't express how much William Bowdern did not want to do this. He was terrified. Like, he truly believed that this boy was possessed by some sort of demon, evil spirit, or potentially even Satan, and he was truly frightened for himself, but also frightened for Rowland as well, because like I said, he felt like he wasn't entirely sure that he was going to be able to help him, but he did know that he was probably Rowland's only chance at surviving this demonic possession, so he did the best he could anyway. He also instructed Bishop to keep a diary of all the events that were happening of the exorcisms, so that they would have something to look back on, and maybe if this was successful, something to then pass on to future people as the way that he looked back on past exorcisms. And this is how we know so much about what actually happened during that time. So, night one of the exorcism, bloody marks start to appear on Rowland's body, but not like cuts or slashes. These were more like burns, as if he was being branded. And these marks didn't so much look like a brand coming from the outside. It kind of looked like it was being burned from inside his skin, pushing outward. And after an exorcism this night that lasted for 9 hours, Rowland eventually collapses with exhaustion and falls asleep. After another night of exorcism, Rowland actually feels pretty good and he's feeling kind of normal again, and his parents are starting to think that maybe 2 back-to-back exorcisms had really worked for him and that's just what they needed. And it wasn't until he woke up the next night screaming, snarling and even biting like a rabid animal that they realised that it was going to take a hell of a lot more than what had already been done. After some time, Rowland asked for the window to be open because he said he needed to vomit, and before he did vomit, he said he's leaving and then puking out the window and falling asleep with exhaustion almost right away. But at 2 a.m. the following morning, he woke up screaming, saying he's back, and the whole ordeal continued. Nightly, more exorcisms were performed, during one of which Rowland's bed levitated 8 inches off the floor and then slammed back down on the ground. And this was quite a common thing during these exorcisms for other furniture in the room, like we know, to move about, to levitate and to slam about. And it wasn't only family members and holy men who had witnessed this, but also scientist and mathematician Frank Bubb seen it happen with his very own eyes. Things were getting so bad at the house that Rowland's mother actually grew very, very ill with the stress of it all. So it was suggested that Rowland be transferred to the campus of St. Louis to give the family a bit of a break from the pretty volatile living circumstances that they were in. So once Rowland was transferred, things got even worse, and in this deep demonic voice that he kept speaking in, he started giving pretty violent and frightening threats towards the people who were trying to help him. He was speaking very vulgar, very sexual things. He was spitting on people, urinating himself, and giving off such a foul smelling gas that windows had to be kept open at all times. In this time, it was almost as if he was also gaining some sort of superhuman strength, where at times it took 3 fully grown men to actually restrain this skinny little 13-year-old boy. And at one point, Rowland even punched Father Halloran in the face and broke his nose. By March 26th, Rowland is returned to his family home in St. Louis and all appears to be well and relatively quiet for a day or two before the same shit starts up again times 100. So it was almost like the family continued to be led into this false sense of security where things would feel very calm and very settled, and Rowland himself kind of started to feel like, oh, I'm getting back to normal. I feel like that last exorcism really worked. And then a few days later it would be like things would come back even worse and even worse, as if the demon inside them was almost playing like mind games with him and the family. While under what seemed to be possession, Rowland started writing things down, including this: I will stay 10 days, but return after the 4 days are up. I am the devil himself. So that's obviously not what you want to hear. And the priest kind of tried to decode this and didn't know if it meant, like, will he stay for another 10 days and Rowland would be batshit crazy, then it would be 4 days peace and then back to batshit again. And it just kind of added like a lot more confusion and fear into the mix because they didn't really know what this cryptic message really meant. April 1st, and over a dozen exorcisms later, they decide to baptize Rowland as a Catholic. Of course, he was a member of the Lutheran church, but they thought that the Catholic might drive the demon out of him better. And apparently the devil did not like this at all, because in the car on the way to the baptism, Rowland actually grabbed the steering wheel and managed to swerve them off the road. So he had to be kind of like restrained on the rest of the way to the church. And when he actually got to the church for the baptism, he was acting so violently and so chaotic that they had to do a mini condensed version of the baptism, because there was absolutely no way that they could perform a full one because he was like frantic. In the end though, this baptism didn't even make any kind of positive difference to Rowland at all, because things only worsened when he became incredibly violent towards members of his family, including physically assaulting his aunt. And he was actually deemed too dangerous to continue living in the family home in St. Louis. So him, his mum and his dad went off back to Maryland again, and Father Bowdern accompanied them back. At this point, Rowland was so physically and mentally ill, and he had lost such an extreme amount of weight, and this was taking such a toll on him as well, that he really needed to be hospitalised. But the thing is, when they got back to Maryland, Rowland was so troubled and so unpredictable that all of the hospitals actually refused to take him, even though he urgently needed medical care. So after going back to Maryland from St. Louis, they had to go back to St. Louis again to see if someone would be able to help him there. And on April 10th in St. Louis, Rowland was admitted into the psychiatric ward at the Alexian Brothers Hospital, which is run by an ancient order of Catholic monks who were very good at helping both mental and physical illness, and they were very well known for their discreetness in cases like Rowland's. But as discreet as they were, years and years later, like a long time later, just before he died, one of the Alexian brothers actually did break his silence on what really happened with Rowland Doe in that hospital. There was levitation, there was violence, there was supernatural goings on that couldn't possibly have been faked. And this guy seen some fucking shit in his time, and the shit that he seen was nothing compared to what was happening with Rowland Doe. On April 13th, Father Halloran, who must have forgiven Rowland for breaking his nose, takes Rowland out near the Mississippi River to get some fresh air. But on the walk, they pass by a sculpture of Jesus on the crucifix, and this sends Rowland into a frantic panic. He goes into full-blown meltdown and tries to run off the edge of a cliff that drops directly into the Mississippi River. Halloran actually had to tackle Rowland to stop him from jumping to his death, and suddenly it was as if Rowland kind of came out of this trance that was taking over him. And it wasn't only Rowland's family and him that were suffering from these events, but also Father Bowdern as well, because in just a month he had lost over 40 pounds in weight. He was covered literally head to toe in stress boils. He was very mentally and physically ill, but he refused to give up on Rowland. He was prepared to die trying to save this boy. What a fucking legend. So on April 16th, a St. Michael statue is placed in Rowland's room, to which he seemed to react differently to than all the other religious figures. St. Michael is depicted as a dragon slayer and is often seen as a symbol of protection. So it kind of gave everyone a little bit of hope that Rowland seemed to have been responding a little bit more positively to this than he had been of previous statues and religious figures. April 18th, 1 month of exorcisms, and Bowdern is still going for it. Crucifixes are burning Rowland's skin and making him physically convulse. He's spitting, he's screaming, you know the drill. It's everything that's been going on times 100. And once again, this demonic voice comes out of this little boy saying he has to say one word, one little word. I mean, one big word. He'll never say it. I'm always in him. I may not have much power always, but I am in him. He will never say that word. But as Rowland is seizuring and convulsing during this voice coming out of his body, he suddenly starts to kind of become calm in a way, as if this was happening to him physically, but he still remained pretty calm, which was different from before, because previously he had been very frightened, very anxious, screaming and shouting for help. But this time it's like it's almost not affecting him like it used to affect him. And that is when Rowland very clearly and very calmly in his own voice states, Satan, I am St. Michael, and I command you, Satan and the other devil spirits, to leave the body in the name of Dominus immediately. And that's when Father Bowdern realises the word Rowland would never say, according to the demon, was Dominus, which is Latin for the word Lord. After this, Rowland had his most violent convulsion yet, lasting about 7 or 8 minutes. And during this time, he says that he had a prophetic vision of standing outside a cave with St. Michael, holding a flaming sword and pushing the demons back down to hell. Then St. Michael turns to him and says, Dominus. After this, there's sudden stillness before Rowland turns to the priest and says, he's gone. This had happened before, but this time it felt a little bit different. But just to be absolutely certain, Father Bowdern asked for a sign from God that this was over. And it was just after saying a prayer that there was a huge boom that shook the entire building, and they had actually thought that their furnace had exploded. And when they went to inspect what the noise was, it wasn't an exploded furnace, but what they seen was an illuminated image of St. Michael appearing in front of them. And it was then that they knew the exorcism of Rowland Doe was over. Rowland and his family stayed in St. Louis for a few weeks before returning back to Maryland, where his life pretty much returned back to normal, just the way that it was before all of this happened. He went back to school, he was feeling happy again, he even got himself a new dog, all which he told Father William Bowdern about in a letter that he wrote to him. And life for Rowland continued down this good trajectory, almost as if none of that shit had happened to him. He was truly free from it. He remained in the Catholic faith, and he went off to college and even went on to work for NASA as a literal rocket scientist. He got married, had kids, named his first kid Michael after St. Michael. If I was Father Bowdern, I'd be like, are you fucking kidding me? What's wrong with the name William? And on May 10th, 2020, more than 71 years after the final exorcism of Rowland Doe was performed and he was freed, he passed away, having lived a very full, very eventful life. Rowland never publicly spoke about what happened, and according to friends and colleagues, this was because he never wanted to be known as the boy the exorcism was based on. It was a very traumatic experience for him, and he just wanted to leave it all behind him and never think of it again. And it's said that during particular times of the year, such as Halloween, when spooky season is upon us, he kind of lived in fear that people would figure out who he was and come to his house just to meet the boy who is the real exorcist person, you know. But thankfully they never did. The Catholic Church refused to confirm or deny whether they believe this was a true possession or not, although 48 different eyewitnesses signed off on the final documentation of the case, saying that they saw some shit, like unexplainable shit. So these 48 people believed without a doubt that this was in fact a true life demonic possession of a very normal 13-year-old boy. If you'd like to continue the conversation, you can get me on Instagram at Christys_Coven. That's KRISTYS_Coven. You can also find me on YouTube at Christys Coven, where I post a lot of free yoga classes and shit like that. And I'd love to have you join, because it's not a coven if it's just me. And until next time, bye!